First of all, thank you. I really appreciated this paper. One section that leaps out to me is your discussion of the parable at the beginning of, excuse my pronunciation, Histoire d'un Macri, of sort of the patrilineal descent, and with each generation a little more of the ritual is lost, and then it closes from the standpoint of Akerman, just a sudden switch to female subjectivity, and sort of the implication of an end of the line. I do not even have a child, right?
Yeah.
And there was something, I mean, very satisfying in the discussion that follows that of the discontinuity of identity and the way in which repetition of a ritual inscribes difference in itself. But what leapt out to me in that opening parable that doesn't really get mentioned is sort of the other side of that ambivalence, because there is an ambivalence in sort of the loss of records and the loss of familial history. On the one hand, it's a site of potential and a site of finding new possibilities. But on the other hand, I mean, there's a very clear traumatic element to it, especially when you consider Chantal Akerman's family history, in the sense that, I mean, the loss of familial records and familial history isn't even necessarily gradual in the sense of that parable. It's often abrupt. There's the destruction of records, the loss of things in immigration or anywhere else. And so just, I was wondering if you could speak a little more to that duality of, I mean, there's the way in which records can constrain and inscribe male dominance, or any number of other things. There's also the comfort in knowing. There's the sense of liberation in being free from that history, and then there's the sense of loss, of losing ground. And so I was, I guess, a little surprised that trauma didn't factor in more heavily.
Yeah. I mean, all I can say to that is that you've said it really well. I really like the way that that you talk about that. I mean, I think that one of the things that happens in Akerman's films is that trauma is actually central, right? And that it gets no, I guess I can't even say displaced. It gets taken up in a variety of ways in her films, but I think it's very much at the center there. And you are right to say that I don't acknowledge the kind of double thing about the ambivalence about the loss of history, or the way that those rituals, when they're passed down, that they change almost so much that they become unrecognizable. And then Akerman says that she's implicated in them, she has to take part in them, and yet she does not reproduce it in the same kind of way. There's a liberation there, but then there's also a loss. So what I would say is that, like, I need to say that more in that section. I think that's a really good idea. I think the whole film is about that. The whole film is about the immigrants, which, again, talking about the relationship to time and to history is intentionally in that film jumbled. So we don't even know in the film if they are immigrants in 1936 or immigrants from the first war. It's like, it's very confusing, and it's a whole bunch of different moments and times that are completely conflated. And then we just kind of have the image of the Jewish refugee, the Jewish immigrant. So that gets kind of jumbled up and conflated, it all kind of comes together, and yet each one is kind of their own unique character as well. But again, all dealing with trauma, different traumas, repetitive traumas, right? But that duality, the way that you put it, or maybe we could call it ambivalence or whatever, about the loss of the traditions and the ties, that I need to say more about in that section, but I think for Akerman it's at the center of everything, and I also think it's at the center of the paper, because there is on the one hand a real sense of grief about losing home, at the same time that there's a sense of liberation leaving home. And that's because home itself has so many multivalent and conflicting meanings that are tied up with comfort and acceptance or love, but also pain and horror and tragedy, I guess. So I think that's at the center of the paper, and I think that it's very central to what she is doing in all her films, and partly because, maybe primarily because, I wouldn't say primarily because I think there's a lot more than that going on, but I think partly because for sure that, and it comes up in No Home Movie. It's all over No Home Movie that that this is the trauma that her mother has lived with and has had to shield her daughter from, and yet it's repeated and very central to who they are. Does that make sense? So I think it's definitely there, and I want to talk about it more in that particular film. That's the one film that I say is the optimistic film, right? Yeah. That's the film that's like funny, and it's just and people are like finding new communities, and it's absurd and crazy, and there's a lot of comic moments in Akerman's films, but that's the one film that you like walk out of the theater and you're like, that was good. Like you feel good about it a little bit. So weird that it is that way, but yeah.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. I also had a thought about that, and I don't know where to go with this,
Yeah.
but that parable,
Yeah.
or something very much like that parable, is at the beginning of Elie Wiesel's The Gates of the Forest.
Oh.
That's how he begins the story. Except for Wiesel, I just checked it actually before I came, because I thought, for Wiesel, it's a story about the importance of telling the story, that as long as you have the story, you haven't lost everything. And
The story itself is
the
the
story,
thing.
right.
Yeah.
I mean, what Wiesel does with that is that there was this rabbi who used to go to the forest and pray to blah, 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 blah. And then you couldn't remember the prayer, couldn't remember the forest, you couldn't remember and the last one, but we have the story.
Mm-hmm.
And so it plays out differently than she,
It's not
didn't
so
hear
far-fetched to think that she got it from
I know,
that.
so that's what well, yeah, I mean, when was the film?
Film's like pretty recent. Like,
Right.
Yeah.
Because Gates of the Forest was probably like in the 70s.
Oh, it's way after
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
So,
I put in the thing when the film is.
yeah, you did, that's
1988.
right. So
1988.
Wiesel wrote long before this. She
Yeah.
might have gotten it from him, but, so the question is, he's also obviously dealing with loss, but trying to turn this into something about the importance of storytelling. And I guess I'm wondering whether, well, on the one hand, she's saying, this ends with me because I didn't have, or, there's a problem here because I don't even have a child.
Right.
But she's got the film.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I wonder whether you know, there, it's another dimension to the ambivalence that you're talking about there.
I mean, I think that's, like, yeah, she doesn't have a child, but she has the film. It's like saying in No Home Movie too, like, she doesn't have her mother, but she has the camera. But then after she loses her mother, then the camera, what is she representing? But I do think that that's an important insight that, yeah, she doesn't have the child, but she has the film. That is her relationship to this history, right?
And to the future.
So I think that is very, very true. So I do think it's that. I think that's the interpretation, right? Like, so she's saying she's not reproducing the lineage in the same way. And so maybe there is this loss, but maybe it is in effect like a new way of having a relationship to that lineage, which is what I try to say about the film. And so I think that's right. I think that's right. And that's why maybe it's that is the happier film. But the happiness is weird actually, because you leave the film and you're like, okay, so everything's absurd, everything's like fucking awful and traumatic, and yet people, I think that it's really true, like in the film, but like people do, like, they still make these connections. And there are still ways that people come together and share moments and definitely like have a laugh, and think about their families and their friends, and they like sit down at a big table together, and they get up and they move around and they talk to other people and they try and help people out, like give them directions to get to this certain street, and it gets all confused, but they send them all, I don't know, but it's cool. It's really beautiful. It's a beautiful, I don't know if you guys are Akerman film watchers, but hopefully the paper makes you want to watch these films, because they really are worth it.
Well, if someone else has a. So I wanted to ask about your descriptions in the paper of your immediate sense of discomfort
Yeah.
watching some scenes, because I wanted to know, I can think immediately of a different couple ways of accounting for that, and I want to know where you stand.
Okay.
Because on one hand you cite Davide Tunisia, for whom the stress is on the immediacy of the sensory experience. But the way that you often talk about this film actually reminds me much more of the tradition of film criticism that comes out of like Krakauer. And that tradition that like, no, like there's no such thing as immediate experience because it's socially mediated all the way down. And so I wanted to know, what was your, where is the discomfort coming from you watching those scenes? Is it the immediacy of the formal techniques, or is it registering something social in what you're observing? Because I kept wanting to know, when you're describing how the movie was working on you, I wanted to know, but there's a lot at stake in how you would account for that.
Why can't it be both?
So it would be both.
Because the
It-
formal
yeah.
techniques are the immediacy of the sensory experience, right? And that does make you uncomfortable. And just like, I mean, I guess there's like the way that you are privy and in this kind of intimate space, and that's kind of both a theme and a formal technique, right? And that you're like looking with a fixed camera. Like in No Home Movie, there's like many fixed cameras set up throughout the apartment, and it's like not even a narrative sometimes. You know, you're just like watching Akerman's mother move around her apartment. So it's kind of a weird documentary-like thing, although it's not a documentary. So there is a kind of you want to say something?
So for you, like, so how do we parse? Because I think of cinema in particular as a medium in which, this is speaking as someone who does not know jack about cinema, that a lot of our experience of cinema, like I feel like I have to be taught how to read and experience cinema. It's not something that actually comes super intuitively to me. This is true of a lot of visual mediums. I feel like, so like painting, like I have to be taught how to see depth of field. even though it's like in the object, it's not actually something that I can
Right.
experience spontaneously.
Right.
And so I wonder, so for me, like it a lot, part of me is suspicious of the concept of immediate experience.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where my question is coming from, like how do you parse how the film does its work? Like even in the formal techniques, isn't there a kind of, don't we still have to be taught to know like how to, for example, perceive claustrophobia?
Yeah.
Or how to like these affects which can feel very spontaneous, like
Yeah.
how spontaneous are they?
Yeah, no, I get it. Like, my students, when I make them watch the film on, they're like, that was boring. Like, oh, that's where you got. So they do have to be taught. You're right.
Right.
Yeah.
So-
Yeah. So how much weight can we put
Yeah.
on what I am saying about how spectators feel?
I mean, I'm convinced that it does the work.
Yeah.
I think I just want to hear more about how you happen to think about the way that it does that work.
Well, I mean, I have a an answer that I actually think is true, although it's not. It's probably at some level it's not very satisfying. Like, I really think that if you don't watch these films in the theater, you don't get it.
Oh, interesting.
And so I do think it is about the experience of being in the theater and watching the film. So my students, for example, are watching it on their laptop, and yeah, like it is boring. Like you're just like, okay, like she's like, now she's baking the potatoes, you know? Like, but when you're in the theater, honestly, it's like every moment is just like tense. Like you feel this thing in your body. It's like, she's right, like she's doing it wrong, like what's gonna happen? And it was weird. So there is something to that, honestly. But given the fact that people are not going to see these films in the theater for the most part, or view them in that space with other people, even by themselves, or better with other people, then what is that? What is that about? And then I guess I would say to your question that I probably am reading, and like I actually really appreciate, I truly appreciate, I wanted to say that more strongly, Davide's work on film, and I truly am convinced by the things that he says about the way that formal mechanisms of film work on spectators. So I really do subscribe to that. On the other hand, what you say about that socially mediated all the way down and how that has an effect on you because of the themes, because of like what your experience at home is, your relationship to your mother, which is totally different than Akerman's relationship to her mother, and like no matter who you are as the viewing subject, whatever. So that is something that's happening too. Davide doesn't talk about that in his work, but I think that I can supplement Davide and talk about it, and it doesn't. I still think that I can take what he says and use that because I think it's. I mean, I always want to have a voice, but I do. I think it's okay.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I have to think about it more,
Yeah.
whether we can have both. I haven't really
Yeah.
thought about it.
I think we can. I'm just gonna say that.
Are we still having time? Thank you so much for this paper. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about or to say a little more about the sort of liberatory aspects of what's here. I love to read something that has things like struggling or failing to remain intact or becoming unmoored or becoming undone alongside things like coming together in freedom. But I think one of some difficulties that those juxtapositions raise are like how those two things sort of work together, or whether they're opposite impulses, or how they might work together both theoretically and sort of practically. Because I think you have to ask questions about what are we being liberated from, what are we being liberated to, and who are we being liberated with. And I think you raised all of these really interesting potential answers to that question, but I would like to maybe hear you say more specifically. Like I see maybe we're being liberated from a particular vision of the home, or a particular vision of the self, or a particular vision of woman, but I think you also kind of suggest that we might be being liberated from a self at all, or a made self, or a neat self, or a joyous self, or something like that. So I wonder, are those in tension with one another? Can we have both? I feel like that's the kind of theme of these questions, but where do you see the kind of liberatory, the primary liberatory sort of thrust of this taking place?
Yeah, I thank you for that question. So what you started with, the sort of relationship between becoming undone and coming together in freedom actually kind of links up with Kevin's comment a little bit, because one of the things that I say about being a spectator to Akerman's films is that they do make you feel, undone, like really destroyed in a way. And then where do you go with that? What do you do with that? How do you understand what is destroyed and what is salvageable after that is the question, right? And then that connects to your questions about freedom and what we're leaving and what we're moving toward. And I definitely, in the end of the paper, I have that section on becoming objects, and what I want to think about a little bit, and I don't think it's as well thought through as it needs to be, but I'm trying to get there, is that I don't want to be liberated from the self necessarily, certainly not the joyous self, I like joy, but thinking about a kind of sense of appearance, maybe, like even if you, like I didn't put Arendt in this paper, but even in like The Life of the Mind, at the beginning of The Life of the Mind, Arendt talks about like how we need to appear for each other. And that kind of sense of appearance, which is a way of thinking about ourselves as objects rather than kind of a Hegelian subject-object recognition, mutual recognition, I really think that there's much to say about the potential of that being in Beauvoir, or at least a sense of that, and I try to speak a little bit about that at the end of the paper, and for sure in Akerman's films, which is why, for me, like thinking about the mother as an object and the camera as an object, and how both the mother and the camera make interpretation possible, but yet can never fully be known, never fully be interpreted. They will always be objects as well. So that is a sense of like what we're being liberated to do, hopefully, is to think and re-understand a kind of way of thinking about our relationships to each other. And this goes back to Robin's questions about where I stand on all these different theories of objects, where objects are both mediate our relationships to each other and are for us as selves, but that we are also objects ourselves. We are not the same, equal to objects, like in object-oriented ontology. We're different. There is difference. There's always difference. But that we might not give up on home, but like think about how to reassemble it differently. So I guess that's where I want to go with this idea of freedom. And I think that that notion of freedom can be captured in these kinds of small ways and small spaces. It doesn't always have to be theorized on the big level. And so I'm trying to theorize it in a kind of small level here, but saying that thinking that way makes us consider, and this goes to some of your questions, like politics, that what we think of as politics more formally, like outside the home. But I honestly think that home is a great place to start. I'm just going to say that. I do, working with these films and thinking about it more, I feel that it's a kind of a fundamental place to begin. So thanks for your question.
Great, so I think there is a reception now for a few minutes, and so if you